Welcome back to Ask a Creationist. I'm Todd Wood. I'm president of Core Academy of Science. I'm here to answer your questions about creation, the Bible, science, origin, evolution, whatever you got. We're interested in what you want to know. This week's question comes to us from a friend of mine who's very interested in this subject. Who are the Nephilim? And now, if you're not familiar with what even that's about, what does this even refer to? Let's look at Genesis chapter 6. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. We've got some specific characters here that have puzzled people for a long time. We have the sons of God who saw the daughters of man and decided they were good and should be married. And then we have the strange Nephilim, which is, in a lot of modern translations, not even translated. It's just transliterated, Nephilim. Some people suggest that it means fallen one. Others have translated it giants. We don't exactly know for sure. Now, when I first got this question, it conjured up images of, aliens come to Earth in the ancient times, hooked up with some ancient Earth girls, and had giant babies. If you are at all familiar with pop culture of the weird and the obscure and the strange, this sort of thing is pretty common. What I found, however, is there is a pretty vast scholarly literature on the question of the sons of God and the daughters of man and the Nephilim. And it is a fascinating, fascinating subject. And this image of sort of these extraterrestrial beings, these powerful advanced beings come down to Earth and marrying human women is not just a modern invention. It actually goes back to an ancient book called the Book of Enoch, which is supposedly written by the biblical patriarch named Enoch, who's mentioned in Genesis chapter 5. So here's a passage from the Book of Enoch where he basically retells the same story, but much more elaborately. It came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heavens, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And they were in all 200, and all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each took for himself one. And they began to go into them, and to defile themselves with them. And they became pregnant, and they bore great giants, whose height was 3,000 cubits, which is, if you know your cubits, that's about a mile. So these are really tall children. How human women could have babies that big, I don't know, but there you go. So that's the Book of Enoch. And this is essentially where we get the whole modern idea of, these powerful extraterrestrial beings, these whatever they are, come down and getting with human women and making giant babies. 3 points that we should point out here on Enoch's interpretation of this. One is that the sons of God are angels, and specifically 200 angels, and he even names their leaders. He gives a whole list. I hadn't put that in here. If you want to look up the Book of Enoch, which, by the way, is not actually written by the real Enoch, but that's what it says. The Book of Enoch, you can find it online. It's available easily, and you can read the whole thing if you're interested. So the sons of God are angels. The offspring of the sons of God and the human women are the Nephilim, and the Nephilim are giants. Those are the 3 points that we find here in Enoch's interpretation. Now, early Christian writers, if we go back to the very beginning of the church, we find that most of the early Christian writers tended to agree that the sons of God were somehow angels and that the daughters of men were human women. So, for example, here's Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, basically 100 years after the life of Christ. But the angels transgressed this appointment and were captivated by love of women and begat children who are those that are called demons, clearly referring to Genesis 6 and the sons of God and the daughters of men. Irenaeus here, also living about the same time in the 2nd century, he justly brought on the deluge for the purpose of extinguishing that most infamous race of men then existent, who could not bring forth fruit to God, since the angels that sinned had commingled with them. So once again, this reference to Genesis chapter 6. So the earliest Christian writers tended to accept Enoch's interpretation, or at least they accepted the idea that this was an angelic transgression where they married human women and had children. I don't know that they got it from Enoch. Maybe Enoch and the early Christian writers got it from the same source, but at least they share in common that this is what is going on. Angels are getting with human women. Now later, things began to change. Jewish authors in particular began to decide that the idea of angels transgressing their state and having sex with human women was offensive, and they began to introduce alternative interpretations. And many Christian authors began to think the same thing. So by the time we get to Augustine, 250 years later, Augustine is very much committed to this idea that what we're reading about here is the transgression of a godly culture of human beings with an ungodly culture of human beings. So in the City of God, he describes it this way: and thus, when the good, that is great and proper to the good, was abandoned by the sons of God, they fell to a paltry good, which is not peculiar to the good, but common to the good and evil. And when they were captivated by the daughters of men, they adopted the manners of the earthly to win them as their brides, and forsook the godly ways they had followed in their own holy society. So if you know anything about City of God, you know Augustine here is describing the long history of the City of God versus the earthly city. The City of God being that destined to salvation. It is essentially the church. It is those people who are going to be saved. And the earthly city, of course, is everybody else, the ones who are destined to punishment in hell and death and destruction. And so here he is portraying this as the offspring of Seth, who are the City of God. They are godly and holy, and they have transgressed and fallen, and even this city has become corrupted by the city of men. And so the idea that the sons of God are actually the offspring of Seth and the daughters of men are the offspring of Cain becomes very common in Christian thought. And so this was what I always thought it must be, right? Because angels having sex with human women and having demon-human hybrids, that just seemed really out there. That seemed like something from a bad sci-fi movie or the weirder corners of the internet. All right, well, that's all well and good. That's the history of these sorts of things. But what does it actually mean? What does the text say? So who are the sons of God? We can actually look up in the Old Testament and find other places where the phrase sons of God is used. So principally in Job, there's 3 references here, clearly referring to some kind of divine or angelic being. No question. They were a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, at the prologue of Job, and then later when God is questioning Job, he says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." These are clearly references to angelic, divine, something beings, people who are not human beings. There are other places where the idea of sons of God is also used. We see it, for example, when Nebuchadnezzar throws Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace and says, "Now I see 4, and the 4th has the appearance of a son of the gods." It's not exactly the same phrase, but it's referring to the same concept, the idea here that a son of the gods is something more than just a human being. Where else can we find evidence of what the sons of God actually means? Well, we find, for example, some ancient versions of the Septuagint actually translate sons of God into the Greek word for angels, angels of God, indicating that there was, in very, very old times, the idea that this does, in fact, refer to angels, as the rest of the text of the Old Testament would indicate. We also find that Jewish historians Philo and Josephus understood the sons of God as angelic beings. Philo is particularly important because he's writing at the time of Christ, prior to any Christian authors influencing the opinion here. And so Philo understands these as angels coming down, leaving their angelic realm and coming and having relations with human women. And then we find also the earliest Jewish targums, which are Aramaic interpretations of the law, they understand the sons of God as angels. Now, very quickly after that, the Jewish Targums began to refer to them as nobles or royalty, that sort of thing. Earliest Targums understood them as angelic beings. So that's interesting. That is difficult to reconcile with the idea that that is just the race of Seth. Now, who are the Nephilim? Used only 3 times in the Old Testament, this term, basically in the Pentateuch. Once in Genesis 6 and then twice in Numbers 33, when the spies are coming back from the Promised Land and they're complaining about how tough it is going to be to conquer it. They say, we saw the Nephilim there, the sons of Enoch who come from the Nephilim. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So here we have the implication that the Nephilim are giants, right? These are really big people, and we are just like grasshoppers in their sight. I don't know that that necessitates a mile-tall giant, but I suppose if you were interpreting this in a very literal sense, you would understand those guys to be really big, the Nephilim. All right, so are the Nephilim then just mythological demigods, right? So we have many records in ancient testimony, ancient mythology that refer to human god offspring, right? So it's especially common in Greek mythology, Heracles, Theseus, and Achilles, but you do have some in ancient Near Eastern mythology. For example, Gilgamesh is said to be part god. So is it possible that these are just understood to be mythological demigods? That's interesting. Keep that in mind here because we're going to see more about that. So let's actually look at what the text says. What a crazy idea, right? So here's the text again. Let's read it and pay careful attention to what it actually says. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Okay, so, first things first. The daughters are clearly referring to the daughters that are born to the men when they began to multiply on the face of the land. And what men are these? Presumably, we would just dial it back to Genesis 5 and 4, where you see the offspring of Cain, the offspring of Adam, and so forth, and Seth. The genealogy is given. And so, yeah, it seems to be referring to human daughters. And so when we see sons of God used in other passages of Scripture for angelic beings, it really does seem to say that the sons of God and the daughters of man were in fact angels and human women. Okay, now, when did this happen? Well, this happened when the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, right? And when is in those days? Well, it's when the sons of God came into the daughters of man. The Nephilim were on the earth when the sons of God came into the daughters of man. It's not necessarily saying that the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of man. I think this is an important point because I think this gets us a hint of what's actually happening here. Now, one final phrase here, these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Well, who are these? Are they the children of the daughters of man and the sons of God, or are they the Nephilim? Well, I think it's the Nephilim because when the sons of God came to the daughters of man and they bore children to them, that's just telling you when the Nephilim were on the earth. Okay, so what's happening in this passage? Who were the Nephilim? I think that's what the passage is actually trying to tell you. They were ancient mighty men of legend who lived when the sons of God had children with the daughters of men. But they are themselves not the demigods. They are not the offspring of the angel-human coupling. They are something different. At least that's what the text seems to be saying. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. What days? When the sons of God came into the daughters of men and had children by them. But the offspring aren't the Nephilim. The Nephilim are something else. This is probably not going to be a very popular interpretation with many of my colleagues who do see this as the Nephilim being the offspring and the Nephilim are something terribly important, but nevertheless, I think that's what the text is saying. That sounds like what it's saying. It is a refutation of this idea that angelic or divine human hybrids are somehow super special and magically amazing and powerful. No, the text says the Nephilim, those legendary warriors, the mighty men of old, they were not the offspring of these couplings. The couplings weren't special. And we're not actually told what happened to those children of the daughters of men and the sons of God. Well, this is a surprising result. I didn't expect to come here to this conclusion when I started this question, but there it is. So hey, if you've enjoyed this video, or even if it made you mad, leave a like anyway, I don't care. Check us out at coresci.org. You'll find links to all our social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Sign up for our email newsletter. Subscribe if you really like this video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.